It's not always clear that a movie is going to be a success, and when that's the case, you want to be sure that you're making the right choice. When a director commits to a film, they're giving years of their life to something that they'll always be associated with. So it makes sense that some movies were very difficult to find directors for because they kept saying no. Maybe it was a money issue, maybe they thought that the movie had no chance, maybe they had some other obligation, or maybe there were creative differences. In this video, I want to take a look at the directors that passed on what would eventually become very successful movies. Before Sam Raimi finally got the chance to make his mark on a live-action adaptation of Spider-Man in 2002, the web-slinger had gone through development hell at multiple studios. In April of 1999, Sony finally got their turn and would make a successful go at it, but it took some doing to finally decide on Raimi. Sony cycled through a number of directors who, for whatever reason, expressed interest in the project before departing or declining it altogether. They asked Roland Emmerich if he wanted to direct thanks to the success of movies like Independence Day, but Emmerich declined because he didn't care for superhero movies. Tim Burton was considered to direct, but according to Amy Pascal, when they met him, he turned it down and said, quote, "I guess I'm just a DC guy," end quote. Burton directed 1989's Batman and 1992's Batman Returns, though he never really cared for comic book movies. David Fincher was also considered to direct, and he took a meeting. In his words, quote, "I went in and told them what I might be interested in doing and they hated it," end quote. Fincher apparently wanted to skip the whole origin story of it all and just focus on the, quote, "idea of a teenager, the notion of this moment in time when you're so vulnerable yet completely invulnerable," end quote. He, apparently, could not take the whole notion of being bit by a radioactive spider seriously. Meanwhile, Michael Bay, who had worked with Fincher at Propaganda Films, was also considered but declined because he didn't like the script that they had. Christopher Columbus probably has the wildest story though. Around the same time that Sony was circling him for Spider-Man, Warner Brothers was circling him for Harry Potter. Here he was, having directed Home Alone, and wanted for 2 movies that were going to be wildly successful. Columbus was a huge fan of Marvel, and Spider-Man in particular, saying, quote, "It is weird because, I'm of the firm belief that every movie would be made better with Spider-Man in it. There's no question. So how good would The Godfather be if Spider-Man showed up," end quote. But him declining Spider-Man came down to bad timing. Terrible timing, really. In his words, quote, "I really probably heard the day before I got the Spider-Man offer that I got Harry Potter," end quote. I think he made the right choice, as the first 2 Harry Potter movies benefited from his warm direction, but it would have been interesting to see him do a movie that he was particularly passionate about. Many other directors, including Jan de Bont, who directed Speed and Twister, as well as Barry Sonnenfeld, who made Men in Black, were considered, but for whatever reason, they didn't work out. Sam Raimi was the last man standing. Speaking of Christopher Columbus though, he was not the first choice to direct the Harry Potter movies. Steven Spielberg was the first choice. It makes sense. Spielberg had won a long overdue Academy Award for Schindler's List not too long ago, and the Jurassic Park franchise was printing money. Not to mention, he was a known quantity when it came to children's movies. E.T., released a decade and a half prior, was the prime example. But Spielberg left over what would be a wildly different creative vision. He had 2 ideas of how he wanted to proceed. The first was an animated movie with Haley Joel Osment providing the voice of Harry. The second was, instead of doing a strict adaptation of the first book, to include events from multiple books in one movie. According to Spielberg, quote, "I purposely didn't do the Harry Potter movie because for me, that was like shooting ducks in a barrel. It's just a slam dunk. It's just like withdrawing $1 billion and putting it into your personal bank account. There's no challenge," end quote. Warner Brothers, of course, did not want a challenge and did want to just withdraw $1 billion and put it into their personal bank account. A number of other directors would cycle through. Terry Gilliam, Brad Silberling, Chris Columbus, Jonathan Demme, Alan Parker, Wolfgang Peterson, Rob Reiner, Ivan Reitman, Peter Weir, and New Kid on the Block, M. Night Shyamalan. Peterson and Reiner would eventually pull out, and the choices would be narrowed down to Silberling, Columbus, Gilliam, and Parker. J.K. Rowling actually wanted Terry Gilliam, of all people, to direct Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Gilliam is an interesting choice to be sure. Monty Python and the Holy Grail is one of the funniest movies ever made, while movies like Time Bandits, The Fisher King, and 12 Monkeys were critical and commercial successes. Even his flops, like The Adventures of Baron Munchausen and Brazil, are quite interesting. But Gilliam is also something of an iconoclast. He wants to make the movies that he wants to make the way he wants to make them, and working with a big studio would never work for him. He would clash with Warner Brothers and leave the project. Then, thanks to his work on the Home Alone movies, Chris Columbus ended up getting the job. One of my favorite Hollywood stories is that the first person that was asked to direct Good Will Hunting was not Gus Van Sant, but Kevin Smith of Clerks and Mallrats fame. Ben Affleck and Kevin Smith had hit it off and started a friendship that led to Smith giving Affleck his breakout role in Chasing Amy. Matt Damon would also cameo in several of Smith's movies, and both acted in 1999's Dogma. The three got along well enough that Damon and Affleck, both in their mid-20s, would ask Smith to read the screenplay they'd written for Good Will Hunting. At the time, it was stuck at Castle Rock Entertainment, who refused to move forward on it unless Damon and Affleck gave up their demand to act in it. Smith helped get it to Miramax by walking it to Harvey Weinstein and convincing him to read it. Damon would later say, quote, "Kevin saved Good Will Hunting. We were dead in the water, and we would have lost it. It would have been made with other people in it, and we'd still be really angry, I'm sure," end quote. Affleck would ask Smith if he wanted to direct the movie, but Smith said no, saying that they needed a quote-unquote good director. His forte was comedies, not dramas. Mel Gibson would come onto the movie and develop it for months, but then Affleck and Damon ran into another problem. Gibson was moving too slowly, and it was getting stuck in what felt like development hell. So, during a meeting, Damon supposedly said, quote, "Look man, we're getting too old. If this keeps going by, Ben and I can't play these parts. Is there any chance you'd just let it go?" End quote. Gibson respected the decision and took himself out of the running. Michael Mann was also considered, but he wanted to take the movie in a different direction that involved Mexican gangs for some reason. Gus Van Sant got the job in the end and knocked it out of the park. James Mangold has the honor of directing what might be the best or second best superhero movie ever made, 2017's Logan. But he wasn't the first choice to direct 2013's The Wolverine, which would help revitalize the character after the disappointing X-Men Origins Wolverine in 2009. Bryan Singer had just made X-Men First Class probably the best X-Men movie up until that point, so he was the natural first choice to direct the Wolverine, despite all of his personal issues. Lauren Shuler Donner, who produced the movies, wanted him for the job, but Singer had gotten himself locked into a contract with Warner Brothers to make 2013's Jack the Giant Slayer, starring Nicholas Hoult. He probably wishes that he hadn't done that. The movie was a total bomb, grossing $197 million on a budget as high as $200 million and getting mixed reviews. Because he couldn't do it, they asked Darren Aronofsky, easily one of the most interesting filmmakers out there. He had done and earned acclaim for movies like Pi, Requiem for a Dream, The Wrestler, and Black Swan. According to Aronofsky, he decided to leave the project because of the long time he would need out of the country. In his words, quote, "As I talked more about the film with my collaborators at Fox, it became clear that the production of The Wolverine would keep me out of the country for almost a year. I was not comfortable being away from my family for that length of time. I am sad that I won't be able to see the project through, as it is a terrific script and I was very much looking forward to working with my friend Hugh Jackman again," end quote. For once, I'm inclined to believe that this is, in fact, the real reason. Aronofsky had a good working relationship with Fox and seemed to have the latitude he needed to direct as he saw fit on movies like Black Swan and The Wrestler. He was also going through a divorce at the time, which could not have helped. Even then, though, Mangold was up against several other directors, including Jose Padilla, who would later direct 2014's RoboCop, another movie that Darren Aronofsky was attached to but would leave, this time over the fact that MGM could not afford to make the movie that Aronofsky wanted. There was Mark Romanek, who said that he wasn't passionate about the script, as well as Antoine Fuqua and Justin Lin. Hugh Jackman approached Sean Levy, who he had made Real Steel with, but Levy declined because he wanted to make original movies at that time. Levy would end up regretting turning it down, which is why he later said yes to directing Deadpool and Wolverine. Eventually, they settled on James Mangold, the right decision. George Lucas has never been a fan of directing Star Wars. The experience damn near put him in the hospital the first go-round, and he was keen to pass off directing duties as soon as he could. That turned out to be a lot more difficult than he expected. Alan Parker, who directed Bugsy Malone, and John Badham, who directed Saturday Night Fever, were both asked to direct Empire Strikes Back, but both would turn it down. Paul Verhoeven was also asked to direct it after Lucas saw one of his movies, Soldier of Orange, but Verhoeven shot himself in the foot by screening his next movie for producers, Spitters, which was too violent for their tastes. He never got a return call. According to an Empire magazine article, Lucas had considered more than 100 directors before he landed on his old mentor, Irvin Kershner, a teacher at USC. Things were not much better for Return of the Jedi. Kershner thought that he had done all he wanted to do with Empire and declined to return. Lucas was on the hunt again and considered 3 very famous replacements. One of them was his good friend Steven Spielberg. The two had known each other for a while now, and Spielberg was one of the few that thought that Star Wars was going to be a big hit even when Lucas himself did not. The most unlikely thing dashed this dream though, and that was the Directors Guild of America. Lucas had quit the DGA over a dispute about where the director's credits should be placed on Empire. It's so dumb and pedantic, I'm not sure I want to get into it in detail, but basically, Lucas put Kershner's name at the end and not the beginning. Both of them got fined, Lucas paid the fine and left the guild. Spielberg was in hot water with the DGA at the time as well though. In 1982, he directed E.T. the Extraterrestrial and produced Poltergeist, which was directed by Tobe Hooper, who had directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The prevailing rumor, however, was that Spielberg basically took over directing duties on Poltergeist, pushing Hooper out of the way. The DGA had even opened their own investigation, and directing a movie made by someone the DGA was at odds with would have put Spielberg in an uncomfortable position. Another was David Cronenberg, already famous for his sci-fi and body horror films. He had only made Canadian movies up until this point. Already something of an iconoclast, Cronenberg had no interest in taking on someone else's project. In his words, quote, "Somebody said that they were from, I guess it was Lucasfilm, and asked me if I was interested in. At that point, it was called Revenge of the Jedi, actually, until somebody pointed out that it was against Jedi philosophy to think in terms of revenge. But anyway, I was asked if I would be interested in considering that and meeting with everybody, and I said, with the arrogance of youth, relative youth anyway, I said, well, I'm not used to doing other people's material. And there was like a stunned silence and then click, hang up. Basically, that was as close as I came to that, end quote. The third was David Lynch, who had made Eraserhead, which got plenty of play on the Midnight Circuit, and The Elephant Man, which was nominated for Best Picture and Best Director, as well as 6 other categories, and forced the Academy to create a new category, that for Best Makeup, the following year. Lucas asked Lynch to lunch and gave him a tour of the production offices, which ended up being quite overwhelming for David Lynch. By the end of the meeting, Lynch, despite his admiration for Lucas, knew that he could not do the job. In his words, quote, "I've never even really liked science fiction. I like elements of it, but it needs to be combined with other genres. And obviously Star Wars was totally George's thing," end quote. Instead of directing Return, Lynch instead decided to adapt Frank Herbert's Dune. Eventually, Lucas would settle on British filmmaker Richard Marquand. When it came time to do the prequels, things were not much better. Despite more than 20 years passing since he directed the first Star Wars, Lucas still had no interest in getting back in the chair. So, again, he tried to find somebody else to do the job, starting with Phantom Menace. The candidates were Ron Howard, Robert Zemeckis, and his old friend Steven Spielberg. In an interview, Ron Howard spoke about the experience, quote, "He didn't necessarily want to direct them. He told me he had talked to Robert Zemeckis, Steven Spielberg, and me. I was the third one he spoke to. They all said the same thing. George, you should do it. I don't think anybody wanted to follow up that act at the time. It was an honor, but it would have been too daunting," end quote. Howard was right. Star Wars was beloved upon its release and, with the passing of more than a decade, was further tinted by nostalgic love. No one, not even the creator, could live up to the expectations for the movie. When George Lucas sold Lucasfilm to Disney, I'm not sure that the House of Mouse expected or appreciated just how roiling the aftermath of the acquisition would be. Hopes were high at the time because they had done well with Pixar and Marvel, but the rubber hit the road with Lucasfilm. One sign of troubles to come should have been just how difficult it was to find a director to fill the legendary boots of George Lucas, Irvin Kershner, and Richard Marquand. Brad Bird was the top choice. It makes sense when you think about it. While The Iron Giant was a flop, every other movie that Bird had made until 2015 was a critical and commercial hit. The Incredibles, Ratatouille, and Mission Impossible: Ghost Protocol. This last one was particularly important because it proved that Bird could not only handle animation, but live-action films as well. Alas, he had to reject the offer for Force Awakens because he was already obligated to do another movie at Disney, 2015's Tomorrowland, which was his first critical and commercial flop. In his words, quote, "There was no way to do that film without junking this film, and we had already gotten George Clooney involved, and I was excited about this film," end quote. Guillermo del Toro, who was also asked to direct but couldn't because of prior commitments, also boosted Bird, saying, quote, "As a geek, I would have loved to see Brad Bird take it," end quote. David Fincher was also approached to direct the movie. Fincher is one of the best directors around, and while it doesn't seem like it, his movies are replete with CGI. It's just so well integrated into the movie, it doesn't seem like it. Fincher was more than capable of taking on such a project. In his words, quote, "I talked to Kathy about it, but I think it's a different thing from, I don't know what Disney Lucasfilm will be like," end quote. He mentioned that his favorite was Empire, but figured that Disney would want to make it more toyetic. David Fincher was also asked to direct Star Wars Episode 9, but turned it down. He found that the time commitment would have been too much. In his words, quote, "You'd have to be really sure that this is what you wanted to do. Because either way, it's 2 years of your life, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's no getting around it," end quote. Whether it would have been good or not is up in the air, but one thing is true about Fincher, and that is that he always makes interesting movies. Colin Trevorrow, Ben Affleck, and Neil Blomkamp were also considered, but each passed on it. Even J.J. Abrams supposedly rejected the idea of directing it before eventually being convinced to do it by Lawrence Kasdan. Zack Snyder was not the first choice for Man of Steel, and as much as I do enjoy some of his movies, I think he was the wrong choice for the movie. I'm sure Warner Brothers would have loved for Christopher Nolan to do it, but he was too busy with The Dark Knight Rises. Also, they had to enter production on the movie by 2011 or risk a lawsuit from Jerry Siegel's family. One of the first choices was Guillermo del Toro. I'm of the belief that most films would be improved by del Toro's involvement, and it is a disappointment that we never got to see his take on The Hobbit. At the time, del Toro was pursuing one of his White Whale projects after leaving The Hobbit, an adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness. He declined the movie, and unfortunately, the adaptation didn't happen either. Ben Affleck was asked to direct, and while he would eventually play Batman and then pass on directing Batman, he also passed on directing a Superman movie. For him, it was size and scale. There was a lot of money involved, but he didn't want to make a big movie. In his words, quote, "A lesson I've learned is not to look at movies based on budget, how much they'll spend on effects, or where they will shoot. Story is what's important. Also, there are a lot of guys ahead of me on the list to do epic effects movies," end quote. Darren Aronofsky was asked, but at the time he was circling the Wolverine, which eventually went to James Mangold, so he had to say no. Interestingly, before Christopher Nolan was attached to do Batman Begins, Aronofsky had actually signed a deal with Warner Brothers to develop a Batman Year One movie, but he left that to work on other projects. Robert Zemeckis also had some minor talks, but in his words, quote, "I passed on that faster than a speeding bullet," end quote. Other directors that were in talks included Duncan Jones, Tony Scott, Jonathan Liebesman, and Matt Reeves, who would eventually direct The Batman. Eventually, Nolan settled on Zack Snyder. James Bond as a franchise has been around for decades, and as part and parcel of that, you're going to have a lot of directors that turn down a chance to direct 007. The most famous one might be Alfred Hitchcock, one of the finest filmmakers of the 20th century, and, for some, the best to ever do it. Hell, the man who created Bond, Ian Fleming, wanted Hitchcock to do it. This was before Dr. No was ever made, and Fleming was pursuing an adaptation of Thunderball. He sent a telegram to Eric Ambler in 1959 asking, quote, "Would Hitchcock be interested in directing this first Bond film in association with Xanadu? Plentiful finance available," end quote. Alas, Hitchcock had already done his own spy thriller, North by Northwest, and instead got to work on Psycho. In the 21st century, Steven Soderbergh was considered for a James Bond movie as well. Soderbergh has always been the kind of director that makes the movies that he wants to make. While he entered discussions with the Broccoli family, which owns the rights to the Bond movies, it makes sense that the deal would not work out because they're known for being quite involved. It would have had to been a true joint effort, which would not work in this case. According to Soderbergh, quote, "I think we were at odds about some things that were important. We had some great conversations and it was fun to think about, but we just couldn't. The last 10 yards were, we just couldn't do it. We just couldn't figure it out," end quote. Amy Pascal, who was in charge of Sony at the time, tried to recruit Catherine Bigelow for a Bond film after her success on The Hurt Locker. According to Bigelow though, quote, "Those opportunities are out there and I'm grateful. I'm just more drawn to a journalistic aspect of film. That opens up very specific avenues as opposed to more comforting avenues. It's a responsibility I'm excited to pursue, where something that has less content is less compelling to me," end quote. Alfonso Cuarón, who directed Harry Potter and The Prisoner of Azkaban, was also offered the chance to do a Bond film once. He described the early stages as an odd experience, end quote. "When the process started and I was going to shoot all the dialogue and stuff, there was a separate team doing all of the action scenes. It kind of felt very weird," end quote. It made him reconsider it, but he was still going to do it until he had a dinner with Joel Cohen, who convinced him not to do it. In his words, quote, "I had dinner with Joel Cohen and I said, 'Joel, what do you think of Bond?' And he said, 'Oh cool, I enjoy Bond.' And I said, 'Would you do a Bond film?' End quote." According to Cuarón, Cohen replied, quote, "It probably falls into the category of a film I want to watch but not do," end quote. Interestingly, one film director that did want to do a Bond film but was rejected was Steven Spielberg. He tried to get the gig after Jaws, figuring that people might trust him with a large movie now, and he tried calling up Cubby Broccoli. In his words, quote, "I called up Cubby and offered my services, but he didn't think I was right for the part," end quote. Okay, fine, maybe he thinks I'm not ready yet, Spielberg thought. Then he made Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which was a critical and commercial success. He figured that now he would get the gig because now he had proven himself. But now he was too expensive and they turned him down yet again. A few years later, he and George Lucas would decide to make their own twist on Bond instead. When you're going to attach yourself to something that's going to take a lot of time, effort, and money to come to fruition, you want to be sure that you're doing the right thing. Some directors come to regret the fact that they spent so much of their lives on a movie only for it to become something that they didn't recognize, such as what happened with David Fincher on Alien 3 or David Lynch on Dune. And, certainly, there's always a bit of wish casting in these situations. How differently could the prequels have ended up if Steven Spielberg got a chance to be director? Or how would the sequels have been different if Brad Bird had directed The Force Awakens, or if David Fincher directed The Rise of Skywalker? What if, instead of directing the first 2 Harry Potter movies, Chris Columbus instead directed the Spider-Man trilogy? What if Darren Aronofsky was able to realize his vision for the Wolverine or even Batman? But that's just how it goes, really. You win some, you lose some, and in many cases, it's not really clear if you won or lost. Maybe the movie would have been better, maybe it would have been worse, or maybe it wouldn't have mattered and they would have printed money either way. On the whole, though, most of these directors seem okay with their decisions. I'm sure they also think what if to themselves some days, but I don't think many regret their decision to pass on a project.